Good afternoon, all. Good afternoon from Singapore, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Saiduddin Faridi, and on behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies here at the National University of Singapore, I extend my welcome to all of you to the ISAS International Conference on South Asia 2023. We will now commence with the third roundtable of the conference, which is titled Everyday Politics of State Delivery in South Asia. And we are delighted to have with us a great panel today. We are joined by Professor Naomi Hossain, Research Professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, at the University of London. We are also joined by Dr. Adnan Nasimullah, Reader in International Politics, King's College London. And we're also joined by Professor Kanchana Ruwanpura, Professor of Human Geography at the University of Gothenburg. This roundtable is being chaired by Dr. Diego Majorano. He is a Senior Assistant Professor of Indian History and Politics at the University of Naples La Oriental. Dr. Majorano is also a visiting research fellow here at ISAS. Before I hand over the session to Dr. Majorano, a quick reminder that you can use the Q&A function to pose any questions that you may have during the course of the roundtable. Thank you, and I'll now hand over the session to Dr. Majorano.
Hello, welcome everybody. We are having an important session today on a topic that has been very close to my heart, which is the everyday politics of state delivery in South Asia. Let me just add a quick note that if you use the Q&A function, and you're welcome to do it, but be reminded that no abuse will be tolerated. So please don't do that. And if you do, you will be kicked out. So just don't do it. Okay, on a more cheerful note, welcome to the session. And I was going to introduce our speakers, but it has already been done, so there isn't much to do for me except to say that this topic, as I was saying, is, I think, particularly is both very important and very underrated. So for whoever has experience of how state delivery and policy implementation work, the everyday acts of the people actually involved in policy implementation, both the beneficiaries and the implementers, is it is one of the most important factors that actually shape policy implementation. But yet it is very underrated in the academic field. Recently, we have been having a wave of quantitative studies, especially the usage of randomized control trials, that would make us to believe that this is everything we need to know about policy implementation, because this is the only scientific way in which we can learn what works and what doesn't. Well, it's unlikely to be the case. Randomized control trials give us an idea of what outcomes are. But then if we really want to understand why we get to these outcomes, we need to go and look at the nitty-gritty, messy, dirty world of policy implementation, and how the actors actually interact and shape and are shaped by policy implementation. And this is, I believe, the broad theme that we are looking at today. So we will go in the order of the program. So Professor Hossain will kick off, and she will present a paper titled The Feedback State, Listening and Responding to the Bangladeshi Citizens During COVID-19, where she will present some recent findings about feedback mechanisms about during the COVID-19 pandemic in Bangladesh. Then Dr. Nazimullah will look at another very timely topic, which is the interaction between public service delivery and electoral contentious and identity politics, which is a recurrent feature of South Asian politics and probably a very contemporary, very timely issue in certainly in India, but in the other South Asian countries as well. And finally, we will hand it over to Professor Rovampura, who will bring us to Sri Lanka and to discuss the very difficult situation, especially economic situation, due to the consequences of high indebtedness of Sri Lanka, and on how this debt is being transferred to poor people who are paying it off, basically. But without any further spoiler, I would hand it over to Professor Hossein. I would give 10-15 minutes to each of you. And then please be prepared to interact with each other, have questions for each other, comments on each other's paper before we hand it over to the public for some Q&A, which I will be moderating. So the floor is yours, Naomi, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Diego. And you can hear me okay? Great, thank you so much. And thank you so much for inviting me. And on a cold, dark, grey, wet day in London, I'm really missing Singapore and I wish I was there. But anyway, that's not the matter. Lovely to be on this great panel with these fantastic speakers. I'm really excited about this conversation. I'm very also excited to share some very, very recent research, so recent that we haven't yet published any articles from it. We've just put out a short report about the findings of the research. And this was research in Bangladesh funded by the COVID-19 Learning Evidence and Research Program, which was an FCDO funded program which aimed to produce an evidence-informed COVID-19 response and recovery in Bangladesh. It was very much about policy-relevant research, but we also wanted to understand some of the broader, understand conceptually, but also empirically, the broader changes we've been seeing in the relationship between the citizen and the state in Bangladesh in the last 10 or 15 years. When I say we're a large research team. There was myself, I was at the time at American University, the Accountability Research Center, a team at BIGD, which is Brack University, and Rajshahi University and Jahangirnagar University, as well as we worked with a citizen organization, Manushya Janma Foundation. So we had a very large team. We did a lot of mixed methods research, including a national survey, case studies, ethnographic work. And we spoke a lot, we engaged a lot with government policymakers about what we were finding at various stages of the research, which was also very interesting. The background to it really was that, at the moment when COVID struck, it was pretty clear that business as usual wasn't going to work. It feels like a really long time ago now, doesn't it, COVID? Like I can almost not remember what it was like. But at the time, I think if you can think back, remember how frightening it was, how we didn't know anything, and how we were all stuck in our homes. And at that time, I think it became very clear, not only in Bangladesh, in many countries around the world, that governments needed to find new ways of listening better to what citizens were saying, citizens' concerns and needs. And so we asked, and we'd already seen that, in the last 10 years or so in Bangladesh, there had been a number of different local government reforms and other kinds of governance and accountability reforms, including the establishment of grievance redressal mechanisms, citizens' charters, right to information, all of this lovely accountability stuff that often sounds very nice on paper and actually doesn't produce anything. So we wondered, did any of this stuff really get activated during COVID? Did any of it actually enable the government to gather citizen feedback? Did any of it actually enable them to use health and social protection services better? And did government learn anything about the value of citizen feedback in times of crisis? So these are the things that we asked. And we had 4 bits to the research. One was policy process tracing, to look at at the different in the different committees and the crisis committees and the the regular policy processes, what happened to change the way the government was trying to gather citizen feedback. We did, as I said already, a national survey to assess what Bangladeshis thought about government efforts to listen. Keeping in mind, of course, that this is a government which has for some years resisted free and fair elections. Maybe resisted is not quite the right word, but anyway, been unable to deliver them, and shows no signs really, no great signs really of allowing very free and fair elections in the forthcoming few years. And we also looked quite closely in certain sites where we'd heard things had gone well during COVID to see whether and how local governments were listening. We also looked at transnational accountability mechanisms. So the World Bank has, for instance, quite strong rules. The extent to which they're implemented or not is not clear, but it has rules that it needs to have citizen engagement and grievance redress mechanisms in all of its projects now. I don't think this is widely known, but we looked, there was something like $1 billion worth of COVID-19 loans. So we looked at the extent to which these mechanisms were actually being used, where it was, because this is obviously a great way of pushing the government to do more, to listen to citizens better. And so what did we find? Well, it's kind of, some of it's a bit counterintuitive, some of it's a bit mixed. We found that there are a lot of mechanisms in place. There was a whole range of hotlines and online mechanisms were put in place for citizens to let government people know what they needed, what they wanted. We looked in particular at health and at social protection and what kinds of mechanisms were in place there. So they were in place, but they were not fully implemented. And an important contextual factor is that Bangladesh has had this quite ambitious digitalization agenda for some years, which is also very unevenly implemented, shall we say. It used to have something called Digital Bangladesh, a whole kind of Vision 2020 program. But obviously 2020 has come and gone. And now it's Smart Bangladesh Vision 2041, and it's very kind of futuristic and very ambitious. But the extent to which digitalization has occurred is as if you've been there, you'll know, very uneven. And actually what we found is that, more than digital mechanisms, online platforms and so on, face-to-face feedback is very common. Informal feedback is very common. Perhaps more than the rest of South Asia, perhaps excluding Sri Lanka, Bangladesh is it's not as hierarchical, it's not as caste-driven or as feudal as other parts of South Asia. And the differences, the hierarchies are not so strong. So people from poorer backgrounds, from lower income backgrounds, more vulnerable communities, do feel quite empowered to complain when things go wrong. Complaint is very common. In-person feedback is very common. Informal mechanisms for giving your feedback to local government and higher level of government are quite common. But we found that all of these things really do matter more than the formal and the official mechanisms that government was trying to put out. So people did actually find government information about the virus and so on quite helpful, quite trusted and so on. But when it came to accessing public services, on the whole, they went for the systems that they knew, which were mostly local pharmacies and so on. The government has quite a lot of telehealth services, and they're highly, they receive a lot of praise, but our survey suggested that actually not many people use them. But certain other hotlines did become very popular. There's one called 333, and it's used for all kinds of things. It's had millions and millions of calls since COVID. People phone up to find out how to access government services, how to fill up forms. Fill up form is I think a universal South Asian phenomenon, is it not? How to get any kind of cash allowances, any kind of food or health assistance. They were phoning up to complain about child marriage, about land-related issues, all kinds of things. So the 333 hotline had become the default platform for any kind of complaint and query. On the other hand, there's like a really huge number of hotlines. I can show can I show an image? I can show an image if it allows me. Does it allow me?
You should be able to share screen.
It's too complicated.
Okay.
I think it's too complicated. Sorry, I can't put too many things on my desktop to show you. But there's a whole huge number of hotlines and helplines, and you know, I wouldn't know if I was in trouble in Bangladesh which one I was supposed to phone for what. But there are, if you can find out, then somebody can probably help you. So people used a lot of these during the pandemic. The most important one, though, really was the Shuraka vaccine app. Now, this was a way that people could register to get the vaccine, the COVID vaccines, once they came on board. And it was also a way you could complain if there was something wrong. You couldn't get the vaccine in your area, or they weren't delivering it, or there was some other problem. In our national survey, 99% of the Bangladeshi people had received the vaccine, at least one dose of the vaccine, and 86% had registered through this app, which is considered to be a real triumph. I think it really shows how, in moments of crisis, the various agencies of the Bangladeshi state can pull together and pull off something really useful that does enable the citizen and state engagement to really be quite strong and effective. So they you know, one government official described this as a spectacular success for Shuraka app. So it's clear that they can, when they need to, put together these mechanisms that really work. What we don't know, we know that people do complain. We know that these systems can collect some of the complaints. We also know that people on the whole prefer to complain in person. What we don't know yet is how the extent to which any of this feedback shapes policy reforms, whether the feedback loop is closed. We know that on the front line, certain actions get taken. If somebody says, oh, there are no medicines in health center X, somebody will go and sort that out. But whether it means there are policy reforms to ensure that there are always medicines in health center X, we do not know yet. And really, to a high degree, the formal mechanism, the formal feedback, remains quite limited compared to the informal systems. We also asked people. So we asked people about, you know, what they knew about the grievance redress services, the various hotlines, and so on, and whether they used them, what they thought of them. And we found that most people don't really know about formal procedures for registering complaints. If they have a problem, they will go and complain, but they'll just go to the person that they know at the centre, or they'll go to their local government representative, or they'll tell somebody, you know, some member of the local elite. You know, we found like vanishingly small numbers of people would call a hotline number or do something more formal than that. And one reason is that many people believe that complaints are futile. They don't really see the point. They think it's better just to kind of figure it out or go and get services somewhere else. When it came to, that was in the health sector in particular, but in the social safety nets, we found that 43% of people knew that there were procedures for complaining about problems in social safety nets in the social protection system. And as we know, I think people know who work on these issues, Diego certainly knows this better than anyone, by far the majority of complaints about safety nets, social protection systems are, I didn't get on the list, why am I not on the list? And then the second is, where's my money? And in these situations, most people, by far more than 80%, were likely to go and complain in person to their local government representative. But paradoxically, when we ask people what they think about these grievance redress mechanisms, these complaint systems, most people thought they were a really good thing. People thought that government genuinely wanted to improve services, and that's why they were putting out these feedback mechanisms. Over 80% said the point of these systems is to improve public services. But when it came to the practice of it, they said, well, you know, actually it's not taken that seriously. 60% thought it was taken seriously, but 40% thought it wasn't taken very seriously when they gave complaints. What really did strike us, I think, most of all, was that you know, they haven't quite done it. They haven't achieved these ends yet. But what we're seeing is that government people really believe in the value of listening to citizens. They believe that feedback is very important to how well they do. And I think we can go into more kind of theoretical and more conceptual factors behind that. But what we are seeing in Bangladesh is a real change in the culture of government. And this is the very striking finding for us that we weren't really expected. expecting to find. That, instead of the kind of command and controlled, highly hierarchical governance system, which perhaps we inherit from the Raj era and perhaps is found across South Asia, we see a very different way of engaging with citizens, at least performatively. One of my colleagues, Professor Zahir Ahmed, says it's performative accountability, but at least performatively they show that they are not your superior, but they are listening to the citizen, and this is something. And so we've kind of left our conclusions are something along the lines of they want to listen, they recognize the need to listen, but they haven't yet figured out how to do it, given the prevailing political economy and other conditions that there are, state capacity conditions that there are. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. And I would just hand it over to Adnan. Please, the floor is yours. Again, 10, 15 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed that, and I really enjoyed learning more about this idea of performative accountability. There's a great book by Isa Deng called The Performative State in China. It's very much about performativity, and it's sort of a really interesting conversation about how states sort of present themselves. And so I am so basically what I'm going to do is graft on to questions about social provision and social distribution, a set of other concerns in political science, thinking about the sort of links between identity, electoral politics, and social provision. And then I'm going to graft onto that work that I've done with Pradeep Chibber in a book that should be coming out in March on populist politics in South Asia, focusing on Modi and Imran Khan in the contemporary period, but also Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and Indira Gandhi and Mujibur Rahman a little bit in the past. So hopefully that's going to make sense. But I'm going to start with the sort of the query, if you want, or if you're that way inclined in social science, a puzzle, which is the idea that essentially the UPA governments, the United Progressive Alliance governments led by Congress between 2004 and 2014, were well known in the policy and public services delivery community as engaged with massive expansions in social citizenship, especially relating to right to food and the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, the Mahatma Gandhi MG Narega. And the idea was essentially that a lot of people were very optimistic about, actually getting a kind of a social citizenship going. But when it came to 2014, the BJP won the elections. They won the elections and managed to get about 31% of the vote and a majority in parliament. And so, in part, one of the questions that comes out from that is, where was social provision? Where was sort of development discourse, and what the state was doing for people, embedded in Modi's critique of Congress, that enabled him not just to enable the BJP not just to win the elections, but win a majority of parliament, and getting sort of 31%, which is a good 10 points higher than the BJP had ever gotten before since the founding of the party in the 1980s. To understand that, I think we need to step back a little bit and talk for just 2 minutes about the ways in which people have been studying the linkages between identity, public and social services provision, and electoral politics. There was a very powerful argument that was put forward by Kanchan Chandra, which I would sort of characterize as essentially ethnic voting for patronage provision, which is acknowledging India as a patronage democracy, right? That most services and goods are discretionary at one level or another. And she essentially argued that in the context of the 1990s, you had ethnic groups mobilizing political parties and getting voters on the assumption that if they voted for that political party, then they're more likely to get patronage for that group. And that became a very powerful explanation for the rise of ethnic parties in the south of India. And in fact, Tariq Thachil argued that the reason why the BJP got into power in the between 1999 and 2004 was because associated civil society organizations like the RSS was providing patronage provision to particular subaltern groups, especially Adivasis, to enable that. Now, obviously, that didn't work because the Congress got back into power. More recently, a lot of people have been a little bit more skeptical about this ethnic voting and patronage provision model, and essentially arguing, usually using things like Diego's favorite randomized control trials, that people are voting for efficacy and success in governance, not specifically targeted benefits to their ethnic group for very straightforward reasons. Most people don't get particular services. It's really hard to monitor. Brokers have a really hard time monitoring provision of services in exchange for votes, and sort of surveys and especially survey experiments are really showing that people are able to transcend ethnic divisions to vote for successful candidates or to vote out unsuccessful sort of politicians. A lot of that work is happening at incredibly low levels. So village elections, municipalities, because that's easier to study than the sort of national picture. But what focusing on efficacy doesn't really work when you're trying to explain massive shifts in electoral dynamics. And so this is where we get into our sort of work on populism and thinking about how the BJP was characterizing its critique of Congress provision, and putting forward a vision of development that is able to reach across lines of ethnic cleavage to people who are not being represented at all by extant party systems. And so ultimately, the BJP in its election had two prongs, essentially. One of them was the idea that Congress was corrupt, and the level of corruption at high levels, right? So we're talking about scams involving crores of rupees, was just sort of building up and building up and building up. So that in general had a sort of a sense of kind of exhaustion and a sense that politics wasn't working for the ordinary people. But also relatedly, the BJP leveled a particular critique on Congress, that their welfare schemes were expensive, that there was sort of underlying corruption, right? That undeserving people were actually getting a lot of the benefits. And that the ways in which Congress does politics, which is to build coalitions and to target particular groups for electoral benefits, meant that all citizens were not treated equally. And so as a result, and this sort of between 2014 and 2019, the idea was that Modi was using welfare for his own politics, but he was concentrating on very, very concrete goods that didn't have as much selectivity. So this idea of like giving free gas cylinders, which was the Ujala Yojana project, or the Jan Dhan, which was giving everyone bank accounts. These things are, you're not actually sort of choosing, okay, what are the recipient classes? Because, you get it's not the worst thing. If you have gas connections, you don't need a gas cylinder, right? But it really helps a lot of people, but it also helps people across ethnic boundaries. So the idea is that what you're doing is appealing to a whole set of people that are not being represented by a particular political party that might have a notion of delimited sense of a constituency in terms of targeting this particular caste or ethnic group, but rather sort of appealing more generally. And that fed into Modi's general sort of sense that he was into development for everyone. The big slogan was "Sabke Saath, Sabke Vikas," right? So that it's with everyone, it's everyone's development. It's not just for particular privileged recipients. And so in some senses, and he did change a little bit in 2019, more of a focus on the poor, but it is the poor. It's not, a particular ethnic, undeserved, subaltern category. And of course, that's in many ways is kind of horrific, especially since he's doing that by creating a coalition among different segments of the Hindu population while excluding Muslims. So we can't forget about that. But it's a really sort of effective form of electoral mobilization that reaches across cleavages and boundaries, where the Congress and the Congress coalitions were sort of assembling many of these little constituencies. And so in general, this sort of focus on universality, this focus on kind of self-discipline. So Modi himself, as a figure, is someone who projects this sort of vision of him working all the time and sort of disciplining the bureaucracy and getting ministers to and civil servants to come to his office, and so it is very, very performative, but in some senses it works against a perception of Congress as being elite or sort of dominated by this rich family. And lastly, and I think that this is really, really important, Modi, as opposed to previous leaders of the BJP, is in fact from an intermediate caste background, not from a privileged background. And so his critique of Congress as being led by elites and essentially buying off the masses really struck a chord among especially lower middle class and upper middle class Hindus, which is a very large, untapped electorate, which is in many ways as powerful now as it was in 2014. And the opposition have not figured out an alternative universalizing narrative. So anyway, I'm just going to finish there. But that's generally just sort of how you might think of this sort of new electoral politics of the BJP era through this sort of language in political science of electoral cleavages, and how you might look at citizen-state interaction and patronage provision through that lens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adnan. And again, I will just hand it over to Kanchana. Please, the floor is yours. Again, 10 to 15 minutes.
Thanks, Diego. And thanks, I should also thank ISAS for inviting and making me part of this great panel, including Naomi and Adnan. To Rajni, Sitara, Jordan, Said, who've been doing all the background work, I super appreciate it, including to this amazing audience, well, for me, which is early in the morning in Sweden, not so dark and gloomy as the UK right now. So I want to I'm going to share screen partly because I'm using some images. I should also point out I'm not even a geographer by training, really. I'm an economist and development studies by training. So my take on how I'm looking at Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka's political situation right now and the everyday politics of state delivery is kind of refracted by these different trainings. And I'm really providing broad brushstrokes, really. And when I was listening to both Adnan and Naomi, I was thinking really performative politics in Sri Lanka is just suspended and mid-bear. They're not even making any pretenses right now from what I see or what I observe. So in terms of sharing screen, let me quickly do this. That is on my first screen though. So everyone can see this, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So in terms of, I'm starting with this poem which dropped on my Twitter feed yesterday. Think of others. Obviously, it's talking about Palestine, but I also saw a lot of resonance of this to Sri Lanka. So think of others as you prepare your breakfast. Think of others. Do not forget the pigeon's food. As you wage your wars, think of others. Do not forget those who seek peace. As you pay your water bill, think of others, those who are nursed by clouds. And return home to your home, think of others. Do not forget the people of the camps. As you sleep and count the stars, think of others, those who have nowhere to sleep. And as you express yourself in metaphors, think of others, those who have lost the right to speak. And as you think of others far away, think of yourself and say, if I were only a candle in the dark. And I thought this really resonated not just to Palestine, which we really need to be thinking of, and the people of Gaza, but also really it also speaks to Sri Lanka in really profound ways, I think, right? So in terms of my own background, I've really done a lot of work, mostly on labor. And when I was finishing my book, my last book, COVID was just happening to come in, and I kind of ended the book where I kind of talked about the fissures and fault lines that have been there in the Sri Lankan polity is likely to unfold with COVID-19, and I kind of assumed that what would come up would be Sri Lanka's the kind of fractured ethnic polity that we have, we've been inherited for the past we've known for the past 40 years, inherited from before. So I call this force of circumstances, taking from Simone de Beauvoir's book, because I feel I was a person who was trained in economics, then moved into geography, and then kind of been pushed back to economics in a sense, in the way I got involved in debt justice work in Sri Lanka. So when you look at Sri Lanka, the nation has been, of course, the heart of academic attention, civil society activism, and media debate since the 1983 ethnic violence in the country. The violence and a war for nearly 3 decades, if we 2009 as some kind of endpoint, which on its own is, of course, rather moot, continues to color and haunt the country 40 years after. The commemoration of July 1983 in July 2023, for instance, was violently halted by politicians, including the current president, who's in denial of their complicity in giving birth, and both in giving birth and perpetuating the violence, so suppression and oppression, which are really the hallmarks of Sri Lanka's polity. The ethno-nationalism that started with the politicization of Sinhala Buddhist consciousness in the 1980s has permeated to almost every significant minority in the country. So it's not just Tamils, but it's all Muslims by now. The nation is unmade constantly and recurrently by the politicians who allegedly want to uphold the nation's sovereignty and the nation as a unitary state And yet, as Radhika Kumaraswamy points out, they recreate the fissures that never allowed us to confront our traumatic past, societal sins, or even start to begin a healing process. The significant sinister presence of nationalist forces are so politicized by various political factions that Ambika Sadgunanathan notes in a significant social media intervention how right now in Sri Lanka you have the religious right-wing nationalist forces, Tamil Hindu and Sinhala Buddhists joining hands to intimidate and unleash violence against the Muslim community. And some of this actually coming from India. However, the layering of violence in Sri Lanka is complex and has been orchestrated by numerous communities against each other. What is quite new, I think, for this particular period is that attempts at kind of suppressing ethnic violence is now out in the open as also the economic disempowerment and economic violence that has continued in the past few decades but has been neglected because the nation has been the focus so far. So contestations over the nation then is also melded with discord over resource distribution and allocation at this current period. Inequities in wealth distribution and resource misallocation, aside from entrenched corruption, and I'll just show some images, have persisted in the past 4 decades, but they have come into full view in 2022 with the Aragalaya. And this differential impact was on display on television screens and broadsheet newspapers, which has tended to shy away from the underbelly of Sri Lanka's economic inequities. The economic underclass, the working class, the working classes that Arundhati Roy spoke about during COVID-19 were in Sri Lanka's case not just about walking home, but they're actually sauntering in queues and sometimes dying in queues because it took so long to simply get essentials like kerosene to milk powder to gas cylinders to enable daily life. The portal to Sri Lanka's sociality and polity then was the economic crisis. The nature and the shape of the economy and who it works for started to, and this was really glaringly made evident during 2022. Although the crisis and its impact cut across almost all classes, ethnic and political groups, it was most acutely felt by the working classes and the low-income groups and across all ethnic groups. Nonetheless, many commentators have underlined that economic crisis and embargoes, of course, not new to communities living in the zones, particularly the Tamils and the Muslims, where shortages of essentials and long power cuts were the daily grind, as people like Ahilan Kadiragama and Ambika Sadgunanathan have pointed out. These were the ethnic minorities as well as the poor, although not all sections of the Tamil and Muslim communities are the economic underclass, even as the working classes also come from the majority community. The intersecting and overlapping class, ethnic, and gender, to name a few social identities in Sri Lanka, are as multifaceted and complex as in other parts of the world. In a sense, it kind of renders homogenized ethnic identities and ethno-nationalist politics fairly empty tropes, as the debt crisis right now is revealing. The economic crisis then garnered focus amongst the people themselves that economic disenfranchisement and impoverishment along with political prejudice were a common lot for most of Sri Lanka's ethnic policy. The identification of economic deprivation and political justice, of course, had its celebratory and symbolic moments during the Aragalaya. Some of those when religious figures, and this is that image, from all faiths came to protect protesters from state violence at the start of the Aragalaya. The standing together of clergy from various communities was quite significant, as was when people of all ethnic communities came together to commemorate the end of 2009. The religious figures feeding the Aragali across ethnic and spiritual divides was kind of made emblematic through the symbolic and religious garbs that they were wearing, as for here, but I'm just taking one photo. And as a study done for the Center for CPA, Center for Policy Analysis points out, the Aragali punctured the run which had existed in Sri Lanka. De Silva, Dammal again, Nilafteen point out that the Aragali needs to be contextually refactored. More specifically, through their research, they observe religious groups perceived as the other also varies by region and is heavily reliant on construct narratives which are shaped by business or political relationships, as well as have shared historical and cultural associations. And I argue we need to pay attention to this because, as Pankaj Mishra gets that splinters are important to grasp because they pay attention to the differences and variations and particular of society that's in conflux, as in the case of Sri Lanka. So in the case of Sri Lanka, Fury, as Pankaj Mishra talks about, emerged in a sense with optimism and imagination of a pluralist society, which nonetheless was not without its contradictions and antagonism. But yet, as Thiruvaraga's counter-hegemonic imaginations of pluralism, coexistence, and cultural resistance to violence, dispossession, and exclusion perpetuated by nationalist, racist, and neoliberal forces are to be fitted underlying and in a sense, the Aragali in many ways did just that, although it did not sidestep questions of justice, even though ambiguities and animosities around political justice was an issue. So from there, I want to in the interest of time, I want to fast forward to where we are now. So a year later, right now, in a sense, an many ways the illegitimate head of state has repeatedly resorted to totally dismantling the protest sites at the Gulf Face rallies, actions, false labeling, and reprisals being the order of the day. This included Ranil Wickremesinghe really violently coming down on commemorating Black July, which was July 2023, earlier this year. And even though many of these commemorations were really peacefully done. So in a sense, a president who was in 1983 a MP and a minister is still in the forefront of this violence. One of the things I wanted to point out is that when we think of debt and the indebtedness of Sri Lanka, there has been a lot of focus on the corruption that's exists in Sri Lanka, very much like in India or in Bangladesh, but there's something that gets missed out in this focus on corruption, which is that I'm not denying that there isn't corruption in Sri Lanka. There is very much political corruption, not political corruption, even business corruption and market capture, as Jayati Ghosh talks about in Sri Lanka. But also the fact that when we have globally, when we have authoritarian governments in power, the law, in a sense, both in the country, and this is also there in World Bank documents, is that loans raised, and this is actually Ranil Wickremesinghe talking in 2013, writing actually to the Sunday Times in 2013. This is what he said, right? He says, as a result, any loans raised under Section 21B of this Act are not valid. And an unconstitutional act is not a law. It confers no rights. It imposes no duties. It affords no protection. It creates no office. It is in illegal contemplation as an inoperative, as though it had never been passed. And he goes on to say, when it comes to repayment, Parliament is not required to honor such debts. Then he also goes on to say, in fact, the next Parliament will not be legally bound by any obligation to respect loan agreements with other nations, international organizations, commercial institutions made under Section 21B. So, this is his using Sri Lanka's laws to point this out. But this is also there in the World Bank, where the World Bank says it's the equator principle, which says if it knows that lenders are giving to countries which are authoritarian and which has no legitimacy, that the loan should never be passed, the debt should never be passed on to the people for repayment. Although, of course, this is exactly what's happening in Sri Lanka right now.
Kanchana, wrap
So
it up,
in
please.
Sri Lanka, yeah, I just last paragraph. So in Sri Lanka, what's happening right now is that the proposed, and I'm just honing in on one aspect of it, the proposed domestic debt optimization is kind of particularly pernicious in that it's targeting workers' pension funds, which is a meager social security protection for working poor. And it is ironic in a sense that when domestic restructuring has been attempted in any other part of the world, it has never gone after workers' pensions. And that's precisely what is happening in Sri Lanka. So we have on the one hand a state that is really taking from the working poor, and in many ways it's about then meeting the interests of the financial creditors rather than the interests of the people. The other thing is, of course, that it's also about the other aspect is that it's also about it's giving on the one hand, and then there's, which I know, so there's a new social safety net that's being promoted in the country, but which really doesn't go far enough given the kind of crisis the country finds itself in. So I'll just stop there. And we can talk about the complex geopolitics as are also involved in Sri Lanka's case later. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you. So I would do this. I would start with some brief comments from myself to each of you, then giving the floor back to you for a few minutes, and then we will open up for Q&A from the audience. So please, the audience, do write your questions in the Q&A function here on Zoom. Well, just very briefly, well, there are some common themes across the board. So Sri Lanka seems to me like a divergent case in which like the poor are not being the focus of much policy attention, but according to the last presentation, are actually being forced to pay a crisis not of their making, whereas in the other two countries, in India and in Bangladesh, the poor are a key constituent part of the authoritarianish governments in place. But again, authoritarianism is something that unfortunately links all the three cases we have seen. But I have some individual comments. Just a thought for Naomi. When you said that the great success of the app for the vaccines, it reminded me that, and then you said that they can do this when they want to do it. Which is, again, something that really comes times again in the studies of state capacity, that poor state capacity state seems to be able to do things one time, but not recurring things. Like, so health, education, service deliveries are, patchy and not really working. But then when they have to do one thing, whether it's, an app for vaccines, or managing an election, then they are much better at doing this. And I wanted to know if this is something your experience also would confirm. Adnan, a lot of things in your presentations that I agree with. One thing that I think it's missing every time from the picture is how important emotions are in explaining big waves. And I think you hint at this in your, kind of resentments against the elites that is being played by the government. But I think we are not, as a discipline, quite very well equipped to understand that in a normal election, so to speak, efficacy, service delivery is important. But then when we have waves, these are usually run by emotions. And all the things like efficiency, GDP growth, or whatever doesn't count. And Modi is, I think, a very clear example. You have demonetization, doesn't matter. You have disastrous COVID management, doesn't matter. He's Teflon. Nothing touches him because he runs on emotions. He is, the big hope of a big chunk of the country. He is the one who will make India strong. He is the one, and these are all extremely important. And I think it really is a key component of the kind of populist politics that he has been playing around. Again, just some food for thought. And Kanchana, I would like to ask you a question about the very last thing you said, that usually when there is domestic debt restructuring, the poor don't pay. Well, here in the old continent, we have Greece, where everybody paid, including pensions and really working class. So two things I would like to ask. If it is very so different from the Greece case, or the Italian ones for that matter. We were not in debt restructuring, but almost. And the other one is when you say they attack pensions, yes, it's working class. But isn't this a case of the labor aristocracy, so to speak, in a country where I believe it's the informal sector where pension is not the case for the majority of the workers? So that is my question to all of you. And please feel free to fit in questions to each other if you have some. Naomi, to you.
Thank you. These are really interesting. They fit in, I think, quite interestingly with each other as well. And I want to come back to that in a second. But your point about the vaccine app and how governments can do things when they really need to, I think, is absolutely spot on. In fact, I've written a book chapter for Kanchana's forthcoming edited volume, which looks exactly at this issue in Bangladesh in relation to COVID. I think, thinking again, going back to what COVID was like, it was an enormous crisis. We're used to enormous crises, existential threats in Bangladesh, and governments learning really fast about how to prevent the next one or cope with the current one. And when COVID came, though, it was such a multifactorial shock. I think that most of us were sitting there thinking, shit, that's it, we're done. How are we going to survive this? We have no healthcare. Everyone's jammed in together, very, very closely packed, the most densely packed country in the world, apart from perhaps Singapore. And 180 million of us. And so we thought, that was it, we were done. And actually the only thing really that the Bangladesh government could see to do was to deliver vaccines. And that's partly because they are very good at delivering vaccines. They have, very good track record of delivering childhood vaccines as well. And it is exactly as you say, not a recurring service, not a very complex service to deliver either. It's a vertical service, and they've always done very well. So that's what they did. So that is why, among other things, they could pull together the political will and the state capacity to get those vaccines delivered. Can I just pick up on your point about emotions? Oh, and there's a whole really interesting notion on islands of effectiveness and pockets of effectiveness in state capacity. I think Erin McDonald's work on this is really rather wonderful. And I think that Bangladesh is a good example of that. Certain areas of really kind of crisis, crisis moments, they do tend to pull together state capacity and political commitment to deliver on those. At those moments, disaster politics is very much the way we make policy in Bangladesh, and always have done. I'm kind of struck by Sri Lanka's relatively recent learning about how to do policy on the hoof, the way that we've always done it in Bangladesh. But this point you make about emotions, and very much in relation to what Adnan was saying, but also to some extent about the debt crisis and the responses of the people in Sri Lanka, which I watched with great interest. My work that's not just about Bangladesh is very much about food and energy prices, and I watched it very closely. This point about emotions is crucial. You know, when talking, it made me think, you know, it's not just that somebody gave a cylinder, it's how they gave it. And this is very important. It's a lot in Bangladesh. Is that they give it, in giving it, and this is perhaps anthropological rather than political science, in giving, they're creating a relationship, of some trust, gas cylinder is that I will get another one in future, or that I may get one in future. I may get something in future I can call on. I can call on that person who's given me something in future. So the gift giving is a relationship building. It's a trust building. It's a benevolence, a demonstration of benevolence, not just a material good. I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Adnan, to you?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I've really enjoyed all of the presentations. One of the things that I think is worth thinking about moving forward for all of us is to think about like how the COVID crisis has led to multiple other crises. And I think that this is true of Sri Lanka, it's true of Pakistan too. And sort of the economic crises and the sort of breaking apart of supply chains and the sort of very much a framework of sort of globalization and the sort of moving on to a new phase and how that is actually really leading to a lot of, you know, actual political conflict and contention. You definitely see that with Pakistan, but on emotions, I mean, you're absolutely right that political scientists are bad at it. You know, like the entire discipline needs to go to therapy and stuff like that. I mean, the way we kind of square the circle is we talk about this notion of populist appeals. And so specifically, part of our theoretical framework is to talk about something called the moral contract. And the idea is that in democracies or in any competitive systems, the governments, and especially in post-colonial context, governments have these sort of obligations to redress structures of inequality and inequity, especially ones that are generated by the political process. And I think what the emotions, the kind of receptiveness or resonance of Modi's message to a lot of Indians, not everyone, right? Because we're talking about, you know, between 60 to 70% of the population not voting for this political party, is that there are some appeals that can transcend particular boundaries and beyond upper caste, the traditional upper caste Hindu vote, by this idea that what he's really appealing to is a sense of injustice and a sense of inequity that's built into the way that electoral and distributive politics has been operated. And in part, like, he's very, very good at that. He's a master communicator in many ways. And you're right, completely Teflon, because things might not work, partly because the opposition doesn't have an alternative narrative. They're still playing the same politics as they were even in the early 2000s. They're not combining and coming up with an alternative narrative. So I'm just going to stop there. But anyway, I really enjoyed the presentations.
Kanchana, to you.
Thanks, Diego, and thanks for all these great responses. I'll start with emotions, although it wasn't directed at me, only because in the case of Sri Lanka, our current president is unable to do exactly that, show any kind of emotion, show any kind of empathy with people. I'm being facetious, but this is really an issue in the country. So Diego, you had two questions. One is, how is it kind of different from Greece or Italy or the European experience? And your second question about the working elite. I'll tackle the second one first. In a sense, it's easier. So yes, you're right. Some 67% of Sri Lanka's working poor, and they're still working, are not in the formal sector, right? Some 67, some significant amount, something around that range. And one could take the view that this is the working elite who is being affected. So does it really matter? But the working elite, so to speak, earn less than $310 a month, which is not very significant. And this is at the upper end. That 310 is upper end. So yes, you have, I mean, yes, this is like some 37, 33, 34% of the population who are in the formal sector. But they're really the working poor, and really that's how I would classify them, because they're not. I wouldn't kind of draw parallels between the working elite, for instance, in Sweden, who are in formal sector jobs, or in any part of Europe, and the working poor in the formal sector in Sri Lanka. So the DDR on the pensions of the working poor, I think, really is significant, partly because it has. I mean, so right now there are 53 other countries that are going, this is according to the UNDP, that's going through a debt crisis. I mean, yes, we've been focusing on South Asia, but there are many more countries going through a debt crisis in the African region, for instance, right? And none of them, in fact, Ghana, from what I've been learning, actually resisted domestic debt restructuring, because this is not a must. This is not something the IMF definitely imposes. It says the debt has to be restructured. It's up to the countries how they restructure the debt, right? So how is it different from Greece or Italy? From my awareness, and people like Yanis Varoufakis and Jayati Ghosh, CP Chandrasekhara, Ishaq Diwan, they've all been pointing this out, which is that usually when you do domestic restructuring, yes, worker pensions might get affected in an indirect way, but you actually expect private creditors, so meaning the banks and all of that, to take some hit, because in a sense, people who can save, for instance, in Sri Lanka are the people who do have money, as opposed to the working poor who only have this meager saving, which is actually enforced on them legally. It's not as if it's something they voluntarily do. It's actually a requirement. It's obligatory for them, right? So it's a provident fund. It's obligatory for them. So Sri Lanka has been different in that to kind of salvage the banking sector, which of course would have meant that people of different classes would have had to take a hit. They've really salvaged the banking sector and gone after the pension funds of the working poor. So it's different from Greece, from what I know of Greece, from Argentina. I don't really know a lot about Italy, but from what I know of Greece and Argentina, it's different in that none of those countries went after just the savings of one particular group who happened to be the working class or the underclass, so to speak, right? So I think that's a significant difference. The other bit I would add, although you didn't mention this, which is that the IMF's second diagnostic report actually pointed to ongoing corruption in the country, ongoing even after the crisis, right? We're not talking about past tense, we're talking about present tense. And yet they release the second tranche of money to the country. So as far as I'm concerned, the IMF is also complicit in what's going on in Sri Lanka. And we need to really call out many actors and not just focus on the national framework or framing only, or the state only, because the state is connected to all these global actors, from China to Japan to the financiers in the UK and the UK, USA, to the IMF itself, right? If they know the Sri Lankan state is corrupt, they need to stop lending to the country, full stop. It's very simple at one level, I would say. I hope I answered that more or less. But
Yes,
there was
yes.
something I was going to add, but I think this came from Naomi, which was about the smart city, smart nation. Am I right, Naomi?
Please go
We are
ahead.
in debt crisis. Huh?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, so we've not resolved the debt crisis, but our current president in his next election campaign is promising Sri Lanka to be a smart nation while the debt crisis is ongoing. I just thought I would throw that in there.
It's a fascinating, it's some kind of tech bro politics. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it's this idea that, we'll digitalize everything and won't have to deal with the messiness of real humans. We'll have all this data. Somehow we will, I'm not quite sure where it comes from. What is the thinking behind this? Well, anyway.
This is when El Salvador switched over to Bitcoin as a currency. I mean, it is a very, that's weird. Sorry.
Yeah, that's weird. It's also again, a common theme. Everybody wants to go digital. It's partly justified, I would say. It makes certain things easier to do. I don't know. Modi in 2019 promised a cash transfer scheme for farmers. And from the day it announced it till the day it actually delivered it to the bank accounts of people, of farmers, I think 3 weeks passed. So lightning speed of policy implementation, which was, of course, due. Then, of course, we have all the problems of people being left out, with people starving to death in Delhi because their Aadhaar card doesn't work. Which then it's an expression of how unequal the kind of the policy implementation circle are, at least in India. Naomi was saying that this is changing maybe in Bangladesh, but when you hear policy implementers saying that Aadhaar card not working is a glitch, and people are actually dying, it's something which very well bring home the point Naomi was saying about the hierarchical culture of South Asian bureaucracies. Again, probably inherited partly, at least, by the colonial administration.
But just on the digitalization, the smart issue, if I can just add one thing, there's, of course, there's the whole surveillance element to it. Why is China so good at this stuff, right? It's not because they're warm and fuzzy and they want to listen to all your problems. That's not it.
Yeah. Okay, so I will ask some questions from the public. The three of you can read the questions. So I will point this question to you and read them, but you can actually read the whole thing by yourself. So Adnan, there is a question posed by Dr. Jiban Chakraborty at 10 a.m., which is how the very personalized way of providing social services in India under Modi can bring qualitative changes to the life of people on a sustainable basis. And if I can add a bit to this question, or the whole point is about enhancing Modi's popularity. Then we have an interesting question to Kanchana by an anonymous spectator at 2:10 a.m., which says that the common theme today is performative accountability. And
Diego, just very quickly, I'm seeing the questions in different order. Maybe we should take one at a time. So I see Adnan's first, then one from me.
Oh, okay,
sorry.
I see.
Yeah.
I see.
I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know if do you all see the questions in the same order as I do? I see one. The first question is from Sneha. Politics of welfare in India has been. Is that right?
But I'm yeah, that is right. I'm the
then
second last.
Oh, then the question next to me is on how feasible is it achieving dead justice with political elite in the driving seat? Before you see the other questions, I don't know. Maybe you're seeing it in different order.
Right. Then let's take this question, and then I'll come over to you. Worst case scenario,
Okay,
just read.
So what you said, or Sneha's question? So I mean, basically, I think that let me combine the two. So I think that the idea that there is certainly, I think, greater efficiency in provision, but I will say that actually the most successful provision of social welfare in India are places where there's actual representation that's competitive. And here I would say places like Tamil Nadu, where you've got two competing at various points populist parties, the DMK and the AIA-DMK, who both came out of, and so in our book we get into sort of the subnational populist sort of dynamics a little bit, and there are different categories which I won't bore you guys with. But the idea is that when you have two parties that are together reaching most of the population and are competing with one another to represent, then you get much, much more successful welfare politics, because then people are empowered, and then politicians are responsive to their own constituencies. I think that the problem that sort of limits to Modi's welfare is very much noblesse oblige. I mean, or like provision of services without the attendant kind of political mobilization. It's very technocratic. It's very top down. It's very much focused on things like other, and so it's ways of targeting particular electoral elites, but they're not addressing, for example, populations who have fallen out of the coalitions, especially minorities. Now, in terms of Sneha's question, I mean, I think that the real difference is that in class terms versus there are two ways of thinking about Indian politics, and these are politics that go back to the time of Indira Gandhi, which is Indira Gandhi's sort of transformations of partisan politics in the 1970s actually kind of destroyed a kind of left-right distinction, which meant that a lot of the people who were opposing Indira Gandhi, who became part of the electoral dynamics in the 1980s and 1990s, were based on identity politics. So this idea of kind of intersectionality, which is a big part of Indian politics, right? That particular groups are disadvantaged in relation to others, especially Dalits, and that's a very serious thing, is a way of thinking about how to create sort of heuristics about how to help the people who are structurally disadvantaged in the system. Modi is explicitly rejecting that because he's sort of saying the Hindu community is one thing. It's united. It's indivisible. It's cohesive, and that we will help the poor within it without acknowledging those differences. So I think that those are just two very different politics of the poor, if that makes sense. And so I hope that answered that question. It's hard to read quickly, these questions.
Thank you, Adnan. Kanchana, I will read out a question for you, if that is okay, because apparently we are seeing different questions in different order. But this question is about this person asked if you could enlighten the audience on how the absence of accountability has, in a sense, been the root cause of the multidimensional crisis in the country's recent past. Within this context, what is feasibility of debt restructuring and related measures at present? So is the lack of accountability the root cause of the crisis in the first place, rather than an economic crisis or political corruption, or what is your opinion on that?
I think that would be too easy an answer. I mean, I think lack of accountability most certainly counts. That's for sure. And the lack of, I saw that question before, and I don't see that question anymore. I don't know why that is, but the lack of accountability certainly is a factor. I don't want to downplay it, and I think we need to be working towards a political structure that is much more accountable. But this lack of accountability is not just within the country, it's also about accountability across the kind. I mean, we live in a globalized world, and to somehow think that accountability is only limited to a country and not see the connections across the globe is a bit, I think it's quite limiting. These are the kind of things that people like Yanis Varoufakis and Guy Standing have been making. Is like globally the corruption of capitalism, as as we kind of know it through the works of Adam Smith or even Marx, for that matter, it's dramatically different what we see right now. There's a financialization of capitalism that's serving just a particular elite across the globe. This is, of course, also within Sri Lanka. So the accountability is not just about the political class, it's also about the business elite in Sri Lanka. It's also about the risky lenders in the West who kind of bought these sovereign bonds. we also know in the case of Sri Lanka, some of these sovereign bonds are owned by the business elite of the country or the corrupt political groups. Yeah, so accountability matters, but I don't think accountability per se is the thing that's going to address and help us get out of the debt crisis. I mean, it's a multi-layered crisis, and I kind of wish I saw all of the question here because it was there and then it kind of disappeared for some reason for me. The multi-layered nature of it, we need to really tackle. And I don't think in the case of Sri Lanka, there is a really simple solution. We have intractable problems, and we have to first acknowledge that we have these intractable problems to start with, right? Before we go to think that one little thing is going to sort it out, so to speak.
Okay, and Naomi, there's a question for you as well, which also disappeared from my list, but I can remember it, and which is a broader question, if you like, but it's, Bangladesh has been a very effective state when it comes to women's empowerment, if we want to use the buzzword, but women literacy, of course, health, nutrition, and etc. Actually, when some of us want to make the case of particular development problems in India, we usually say, look at Bangladesh. They have done it so well in so little time. So the question is, how did you do it? How did Bangladesh do it?
Yeah, I mean, it is a good question, and it's relevant to this question of the everyday politics, I think, of state service delivery. One thing I'd say is not specific programs that are in Bangladesh, although some of them are, but very much more about the political commitment to delivering on those. As we said, governments can have all kinds of programs and all kinds of policies, but not all of them are implemented very well, and some are higher political priority than others. I think both, the situation of the rural women, in the 1970s in Bangladesh was very dire, and poverty and hunger in particular were really widespread, very, very widespread. One famous economist in Bangladesh has said that the development problem was the food security problem in Bangladesh. There wasn't really another problem. It was people were not eating. I think it was just a high political priority. But yes, there were programs as well, and I think the targeting that we now think of as quite common in social protection schemes, the targeting to the rural poor, to rural women, and so on, particularly the targeting of women, is something that was pioneered very much in the 70s in Bangladesh. Before anyone else was doing that, they were doing that, making sure that resources went to the poorest women in the first place. So I'd say that would be, it's more the nature of the programs than the specific, the specific programs themselves. I think a lot of people think that microfinance and the NGO schemes were important, and they have been important, but their importance has been greatly overstated in Bangladesh's achievements. It's a huge country. NGOs never covered more than a portion of them. Microfinance has been important, but not so much as poverty reducing as consumption smoothing and vulnerability reducing, I think, is the important feature of microfinance. I think the consensus is growing that that's the case. But yeah, the main thing was a political commitment to doing these things that, neither India nor Pakistan nor indeed Sri Lanka or other South Asia countries had that existential threat that pushed them to prioritize these issues.
That is probably true. It's I agree with a lot of that, and also with the thing that you said that political welfare schemes are important, but only to a point, and it's more maybe the whole of the welfare architecture. You get a badly implemented cash transfer scheme, a badly implemented worker scheme, a badly implemented food security scheme. But if you add them all up, then it does kind of work. Anyway, I think we have to wrap it up, unless there is a very quick and final thought all of you want to share. Otherwise, I think we can close it here. Anything you want to add, the three of you?
Do you mean the entire session, Diego, or the question?
Oh, anything really. We have literally like a minute if you want to wrap up with some final comments.
Is it I have the time till 10:45. Is that right or wrong? Maybe one of the organizers can tell us.
I think, I have 10:30.
Jordan, Saeed? Because there are loads of, I mean, I was thinking there are loads of questions on the Q&A.
It is still 10:30, but you can go.
10:30. Okay. Sorry, that's fine.
Okay,
that's fine.
sorry. I was, I was socialized into Singapore timings, which are usually quite strict, but this doesn't happen anyway. In this case, it's a South Asian conference chaired by an Italian, so it makes sense. Okay, so let's go on with the question then. How there is a question for you, Kanchana. How feasible is achieving that justice with political elite in the driving seat, while same political elite are trying to consolidate their own interest? So how can a political system that is part of the problem being, also part of the solution? Do we need a revolution? That is the subtitle.
The revolution is ongoing in Sri Lanka. I would be optimistic and say the revolution is ongoing in Sri Lanka. I mean, I know people thought of the Aragale as the revolution, and it was disrupted. Yes, it is disrupted or interrupted. I guess the short answer is really, I agree that, as long as the political system has to change, but more than the political system, as long as the current political class is in power, we are not going to be able to strike at a feasible debt justice pact, so to speak, right? But this is why we really need to be calling for elections very strongly. The president has no legitimacy, the parliament really has no legitimacy, and yet they continue to broker deals for the country, right? So the short answer is, how feasible? If we stay with the current status quo, it's not very feasible. But I also think any other kind of political constellation that comes in, if there's election and that comes into play, they're going to have a difficult time. And I think in Sri Lanka, we really need to be kind of thinking about doing coalition politics in a different way, and like parties like Sajaba and the NPP really working together and coming together. Because what I see now is a lot of splint. There's Dilith Jayavira, who's put his hat on this thing for a president election. This is Sri Lanka's kind of like what's his name, Berlusconi. This is like the Berlusconi of Sri Lanka to some extent, who's trying to make his appearance. So yeah, the short answer, it's going to be difficult. It's not going to happen. It's not even going to be difficult. It's not going to happen. But we really have to be pushing for elections, because for anything to kind of shift, there has to be elections. And that's what the president for now is curtailing. And again, how serious is the world about democracy are also questions that we need to be asking about, because I don't see that seriousness. We pay a lot of lip service to, or the West pays a lot of lip service to democracy, but do they really try to ensure that's upheld? This is up for grabs still. Yeah, I'll just keep it there.
Yeah, well, in Italy we have the opposite model. When we are in a deep crisis, we don't go for election, and we call somebody who is supposedly above politics, like Mario Draghi or Mario Monti, to manage the thing, because we don't trust the political class to extricate themselves from a crisis and take the difficult decisions, and etc. but it's not a model I would recommend. Anyway, there is a question which I think it's good for both Naomi and Adnan, which is about the importance of, from Divya, about the federal structure and how important it is. If I can paraphrase the question a little bit, we, both Bangladesh and India, are increasingly centralized states, right? And welfare delivery, at least in India, which is the case I know quite well, welfare delivery is centralized. The whole point is the prime minister pushes a button in the control room and bam, the cash gets into the people bank account. And then you find also, the picture of Modi in every, possible venue, including vaccine certificates or, receipts of cash transfer and so on and so forth. But at the same time, implementation goes through the federal structure. And I guess in Bangladesh could be a similar way of doing. It adds up to the digitalization. The digitalization is also a form of centralization of policy implementation. So how important still is the federal structure or local level, lower tiers of policy implementation?
Naomi, do you want to start?
No, you go first. You go first.
Okay. So I think that one of the things that's been really successful for Modi is that a number of these states are actually BJP states as well. So Uttar Pradesh and others, where essentially the problem of credit claiming, right, has actually been solved by the fact that all of the chief ministers are not building their own brands, but rather deferring to the Modi brand. So that's a big difference. I mean, I think that the way I think about it is that there are states and especially in southern India that, because they have their own sort of model of branded, if you want, goods and services provision. I mean, the midday meal was originally a sort of a Tamil idea. That's actually going to make things very difficult for the BJP to take over, because essentially people already feel like they're connected to the state that is somewhat responsive. But that's not that essentially that's the previous politics that actually drives a kind of a more active and responsive state politics that is not sort of embedded in the constitution or anything that is sustainable, absent other types of political mobilizations that existed before. So it's not really, I think it has been hugely centralized. I think there are firewalls because you're not going to be able to take over places like Kerala or Tamil Nadu as easily, or even West Bengal. Because there you're trying to look for the people who are not being represented in the system. But it is definitely more centralized, and it's definitely more made more efficient. And there are a lot of people who are suffering because of that centralization, but also a lot of people are benefiting from it. So, political science.
Yeah, I think the question, of the centralization and decentralization in Bangladesh is also very relevant. Although it is not a federal system, and it is a highly centralized system. And in fact, it has been written about as a rare state that has become more centralized over time. And there's been a compression of the political layers, as it were, and digitalization, as you rightly point out, Diego, has had the effect of further centralization. And they have this agenda called G2P, government to people, which is this idea that, and it's not just government, it's the Prime Minister herself. Sheikh Hasina will be sending messages directly to citizens. I did some work on one of these cash transfer schemes, conditional cash transfers. It was a small payments they make to all the children who attend government primary schools, small monthly payments if they show up. Every single child who goes to a government school gets it. But it goes to the mobile phone of mothers. So you get this message from the Prime Minister on your mobile phone for you to buy textbooks or pencils or whatever it is. I mean, it's a very direct relationship. And the smart agenda, the Smart Bangladesh agenda, is very much about cementing that closeness. At the same time, as our researchers show, really quite keen to have face-to-face personal interaction with their government officials, to be able to talk to people directly when they have problems. They're not very keen to have to put their information on some platform and off it whizzes to Dhaka or wherever. So there is tension there. But in terms of service delivery, for many reasons, the centralized continues. It's for anti-corruption purposes. It's for better implementation. It's for transparency. It's for surveillance. It's for many different reasons. Centralization is proceeding and increasing, I would say, in Bangladesh.
Okay, at this point, I really feel we should wrap it up. And I thank all three of our speakers, Professor Hossain, Professor Ravanpura, and Dr. Nazimullah. And thank you all of you for listening. And in less than an hour, I think, there is another session. Please, organizer, correct me if I'm wrong, but is that right, Rajni?
Yeah,
yes,
that's correct.
Good. Yes, good. And so you're all invited to follow along the remaining part of this conference. Thanks, everybody, and bye-bye.
Thanks a lot for having us here again, and it's been great
Thank you so much
being with everyone.
Thank you, Diego. Thank
you
you,
again,
everyone.
Rajni and Jordan.
Okay.
See you soon.
And apologies to some of the audience that we weren't able to answer some of the questions.